Russia heads to the polls on Sunday to choose its president, but the election is being called a mere formality and a one-horse race. The current president, Vladimir Putin, is, many say, as good as being re-elected. And a victory would mean Putin gets another 6-year term, which would end in 2024. In the run-up to the elections, Russia's main opposition leader, Alexei Navalny, has been formally barred from standing because he was found guilty of embezzlement. Navalny, however, has been claiming that the charge was politically motivated. 7 names beside Putin's will appear on ballot papers, although they span from right to left across the political spectrum. With Putin in the picture, no candidate besides the incumbent ranks above 10% in the state-owned polls. So who is Vladimir Putin up against? Ksenia Sobchak, a television host and socialite, sometimes referred to as the Russian Paris Hilton in local media. The 36-year-old liberal candidate from St. Petersburg was the head judge on Russia's version of America's Next Top Model. Sergei Baburin, the head of the ultra-nationalist Russian All People's Union. He served in the war in Afghanistan for a year in the early 1980s. Pavel Grudinin, a prominent businessman, is a presidential candidate put forward by the Communist Party of the Russian Federation. Next is Vladimir Zhirinovsky. He is the leader of the ultra-nationalist Liberal Democratic Party of Russia. When he ran for the presidency in 1993, he pledged Russian men would get cheaper vodka and the nation would rebuild its empire. Maxim Surokin is the leader of the Communists of Russia party. He is calling for the return of communism and the resurrection of the USSR. Boris Titov is a businessman and head of the Growth Party. Titov is set to represent the interests of the big businesses close to the Kremlin. Grigory Yavlinsky is an economist and an opposition leader. He is one of the founders of the liberal Yabloko party, which was the main liberal party in the Russian domain until 2003. For Vladimir Putin, perhaps the real concern is not winning, but the voter turnout, which is key to giving his 4th term a legitimacy the Kremlin clearly craves for. In recent weeks, everything from sponsored lotteries to free medical checkups to food discounts have been used to lure Russians to the polling booths. Let's go straight across now to political analyst Dmitry Babish, who is joining us from Moscow for more on this. It's already been called a Putin versus Putin battle. Is this election as predictable as it could get?
No, I think it's a simplification because obviously there are serious candidates besides Putin. I would single out Pavel Grudinin, who has the support of the Communist Party. I would say the 2nd biggest party in the country with hundreds of thousands of activists and members. I think that the reason why Putin will most likely win this election, that is the pressure from the West, which basically had the adverse effect. I mean, if the United States and the EU, if they hoped that by not allowing the Russian athletes to compete at the Olympic Games under the national flag, if they thought that people would get angry at Putin, the result was quite the opposite. People got angry at the West, at the United States, the European Union, and the International Olympic Committee. The same was true about the Western support for the new regime in Ukraine. And a lot of other things. However, people are not quite happy with the liberal financial and economic policy under Putin. So a lot of people may vote for Grudinin, not because they dislike Putin, but because they want to send Putin a message that he needs to make the economic policy more leftist, less Western-oriented, less monetarist. So Grudinin can get a lot of votes. I would not be surprised if he gets them.
Okay, Dmitry, there's also the aspect of how Political activists, observers who were wanting access to polling centers, their documents were seized just a few days before the election, and a leading election watchdog was had to witness its office lease being revoked. What explains these? And this is, of course, just a sample of the clampdown we've seen in terms of this election.
Well, let me tell you that there will be 1,500 foreign observers coming to this election, and a lot of them from Western organizations. As usual, a lot of them very critical of Russia and of its government. So there will be also a lot of observers inside Russia. All the liberal parties will have their observers at the polling stations. You mentioned that this organization, which had problems, it's called Golos, or Voice. Well, I wouldn't call it the main election watchdog. That's how the Western press tries to present it. In the same way, a lot of Western newspapers write that Alexei Navalny is the main, opponent of Mr. Putin. But if you look at the ratings of Navalny, they're pretty low. Because a lot of people are afraid of his rhetoric when he says that he will put lots of people in jail. When he goes to the so-called Russian marches on the 4th of November, these are basically kind of neo-Nazi meetings. So in any Western country, a politician who would go to neo-Nazi rallies would not be allowed to run. So in Russia, the authorities found another pretext not to allow Navalny to run, his business operations. But believe me, he would not be allowed to run in the countries, I don't know, like France or Germany. As for elections, even the supporters of Mr. Yavlinsky, who is a pro-Western liberal, even the supporters of Ksenia Sobchak, they all acknowledge that most likely their candidates are not going to win. They acknowledge that Putin has tremendous popularity and he can win without any tampering with the ballots. But the authorities have done everything to make this election, deserving trust. There are literally tens of thousands of observers, some of them foreign. So I don't think, I don't doubt that the ballots will be counted in the right way. The fact that there is not enough intrigue in this election, it is mostly due to the reasons that I gave you. But there is intrigue to my mind, and that is how many votes will Pavel Grudinin, the main candidate of the left forces, will get at this election. That will be a powerful message to Putin if Grudinin gets a lot of votes.
Okay, Dmitry, also we've seen several ways through which the electorate has been lured in a way to ensure that the maximum voter turnout is ensured on the day of the election. Why is it so important for Putin, for example, to have food discounts being given out, free medical checkups, sponsored lotteries? Why has this election become a lot more about ensuring the maximum voter turnout?
Well, it's an old tradition, for years, even when Russia was very poor in the 90s, the authorities tried to attract the voters by, for example, selling cheap food or offering all sorts of services, like primitive medical services at the polling stations. For Russians, elections, traditionally, it's not only a political event, it's also a social event, I meet a lot of my neighbors when I go to vote. For me, it's an opportunity to see some friends whom I haven't seen maybe for months, maybe for years. Russia is under tremendous pressure right now. We have this scandal with Britain,
yes,
where before the investigation was concluded, Russia was accused of, I quote the British Prime Minister, attacking the UK with chemical weapons. That, of course, creates a lot of unease in society because people watch television, not only Russian television, but foreign television, global television, and people are concerned. And in this situation, people think about politics. And the elections is the easiest and I would say the most legal way to express your opinion on what's going on. Let me tell you that, for example, some of the candidates recommend surrendering to the West, fulfilling all of their wishes, such as, pulling the troops out of Syria, allowing the Ukrainian regime to take Crimea back. We have heard it from Ksenia Sobchak, from Grigory Yavlinsky. So there is also that option. And it will be interesting to see how many Russians would choose this kind of option.
I was just coming to that. Speaking of pressure, of course, how and to what extent do you see this diplomatic face-off between UK and Russia actually impacting the voter turnout?
I think it will increase the number of voters, just like any steps taken by the West in order to pressure Russia. Traditionally, Russians do not like to do anything under pressure. Russia has been an independent state during all of its history. We have never been a colony. We consider ourselves a European power, and in this situation, when the West tries to intimidate Russia, usually the result is the opposite. I mean, people stand up and say, we have never been a colony. We are not going to allow you to dictate us your will. So that is the prevailing mood in Russia. Of course, there is a minority that says that, the Western nations have always been happier and maybe smarter than Russians. But these people are a minority. In the 90s, they were almost a majority. But it was a very special period in Russian history. I think this period is over due to many disappointments that Russia had with the West. I think the disappointments started when NATO attacked Yugoslavia in 1999. They continued with the invasion of Iraq in 2003, of Libya. So now the majority of Russians want to resist the Western pressure. And how can you resist it? Come to the polling stations and vote for Putin. That is the easiest way.
Okay, Dmitry Babish, appreciate very much you joining us on the broadcast with those perspectives. Russia, of course, is just a few hours away from choosing its next president, but that will be our top focus in our later editions and all through Sunday as well.